want to start off by thanking everyone for their comments and the overwhelmingly positive response I received on my personal stories on racism. I don't think that my stories are remarkable, and I think that my delivery of them were more prone to put people to sleep than anything else, but the support has been incredible, so thank you. It makes me look forward even more to hearing the stories that other people will tell as part of this series. There are going to be people who are much better storytellers than I am, and they're going to have much more visceral stories to tell. So I'm really excited. I received a few lengthy and very thoughtful letters from my neighbors sharing their thoughts on racism. One of them centered on a point that I think a lot of people have conflicting views on. He felt that I was justified to have a healthy paranoia of black men after my experience. He later stated that paranoia was probably too strong of a word, but I can't think of a better word to express that idea. Similarly, one widely shared viewpoint is that black men have higher crime rates than other groups, and so it is prudent to leave more space between yourself and black men. There's no getting around the fact that black men are incarcerated at higher rates than other groups, but there are a lot of factors to explain why. First, we need to reject the myth that black people are more violent by nature. There's no genetic evidence for this. In fact, there's no genetic support for grouping people by race, period. In a paper published in the journal Science in 2016, researchers studied human genomes from across the world, and they couldn't find a single absolute genetic difference between people of one part of the world and those of another. Race is an easily identifiable characteristic that our brains use to distinguish between one person and another, and it's become a social construct that humans use to easily identify in-groups and out-groups. Ibram X. Kendi documents in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, how anti-black discrimination was first used to justify the enslavement of black Africans in the 1400s for the publicly stated purpose of saving souls through Christian conversion and the unstated purpose of the hugely profitable slave trade. Since the 1400s, non-blacks have used a combination of pseudoscience and religion to claim the inferiority and inhumanity of blacks in order to justify anti-black discrimination. And it continues to today. When a black person commits a crime, it's seen as a reflection on all black people. But when a white person commits a crime, it's seen as only the failings of that individual. So having black skin doesn't make a person more likely to be violent. However, it does make that person more likely to face discrimination. So what are the factors that explain why black men commit more crime? First, there's correlation between employment and, in particular, higher quality employment and crime. The higher the employment rate and the higher the income from a job, the lower the chance a person will commit a crime. There are a lot of reasons why higher employment leads to lower crime. Employed people have less time to commit a crime. People employed with well-paying jobs have a higher opportunity cost for committing crime. If they commit a crime, they risk losing their good job. Higher than minimum wage employment pays better than most criminal enterprise. And being employed allows you to see good role models in your company and socializes a person to obey the law. Anti-black discrimination means that blacks have less job opportunities than other people and have to work harder to obtain the same jobs. Resumes with black-sounding names get callbacks at half the rates than when those same resumes are submitted with white names. And racial discrimination often intensifies the higher up the employment ladder you go, with one black venture capitalist saying that investors tell him that they can't fathom what it would be like to have a black person on a startup's board. And he added that that's a real conversation that I have multiple times a year. So racial discrimination makes it harder for blacks to obtain and advance in jobs, and lower levels of employment leads to higher criminality. There's an overwhelming consensus based on volumes of empirical research that post-secondary education is one of the most successful and cost-effective methods of preventing crime. More post-secondary education very likely reduces crime. Unfortunately, post-secondary educational attainment is highly related to household income. A person's chances of attaining higher education is tied to their household income and the quality of the primary and secondary schools in their area. Household income impacts higher education attainment because higher education costs money. There are tuition and possibly housing expenses, but even if those are covered by external funding, there are opportunity costs with attending more school. Instead of attending a community college or a four-year college, you could be working or looking after younger siblings. In 2016, the median black household with children had less than 1% of the wealth of the median white household with children. Look at the bar for black households in 2016 on this graph. You can barely see it because that's how little the median black family has in wealth in comparison to white families. This is what people mean when they say that white families and families of color are not playing on a level playing field. Black children and white children are expected to run a race and start at the same starting line and at the same time, except that the average white child is given a motorcycle to use in the race, while the average black child starts off malnourished and doesn't have shoes. The ability of primary and secondary schools to prepare its students for higher education is dependent in part to its funding. In America, school funding is tied to property taxes. Since black families have less than 1% of the wealth of their white counterparts, it should come as no surprise that black families are 5 times more likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods than white families. Lower property values means lower property taxes, translating to less school funding and lower quality schools that don't prepare its black students to attend higher education as well as those in wealthier communities. So because black households have less wealth, blacks are less able to afford higher education and attend schools that do a poor job of readying its students for higher education. Lower levels of post-secondary school attainment lead to less employment opportunities and more chances for blacks to get into legal trouble when they aren't attending schools in the years that people typically commit crime at the highest rates in their lifetime. Racial discrimination can be seen throughout the criminal justice system, where blacks are overpoliced, charged with more serious offenses, and receive longer prison sentences than their white counterparts who commit the same crime. There is a long history of using the law to criminalize African Americans in the U.S., from slave codes that made it a crime for blacks to defend themselves when assaulted by a white person, to the black codes that outlawed blacks from learning to read and write in the post-Civil War era, to Jim Crow laws that mandated segregation until 1965. Though the vast majority of overtly racist criminal law has been removed from the law books today, anti-black discrimination in the criminal justice system continues. And this is well documented in drug-related crimes. Though blacks make up 15% of the country's drug users, they comprise of 37% of those arrested for a drug offense, 59% of those convicted, and 74% of those sentenced to prison for drug violations. This is worth repeating. Blacks make up 15% of the drug users in the U.S., but comprise of 74% of those sentenced for a drug offense. The racial disparities in policing, conviction, and sentencing are repeated for most types of crime because, in effect, the U.S. operates 2 criminal justice systems, one for the wealthy and the other for the poor and people of color. The wealthy hire top-notch teams of lawyers to throw out and water down charges and lighten sentencing, while almost everyone else relies on a public defender who is overworked and underpaid. Racial discrimination in the criminal justice system is arguably the primary reason that blacks have higher crime rates than other groups. If you want to learn more about this, click on the video above to watch Michelle Alexander's lecture on the new Jim Crow, where she convincingly describes how mass incarceration of people of color has created a new underclass of Americans that with less rights and opportunities than everyone else. Being incarcerated increases a person's likelihood of committing additional crimes because criminal convictions greatly limit a person's employment, education, and housing opportunities. A lot of employers will not hire a person with a criminal history, limiting free people's opportunities to make or sustain a living through legal jobs. Having felony drug convictions makes a person ineligible to receive federal student aid, making higher education unaffordable. Housing discrimination against people with a criminal history is legal and makes it difficult for those people to move to communities where there are more job opportunities and better schools, opportunities that, if available, would reduce crime rates. Similarly, higher levels of crime in a community decrease educational attainment by making it harder to focus on academics. When students have to worry about being shot or robbed or assaulted, or worry about family members who might experience these things, learning in school quickly becomes secondary to just survival. Finally, when you have friends that commit crime, especially when you are a teenager, you're much more likely to commit crime. During the teenage years, you spend a lot more time around friends than during other phases in your life. And friends become the primary role models for teens. As teens are trying to figure out who they are much more susceptible to peer pressure and want to model a respected friend's behavior. This means that higher rates of crime in Black communities influences teens in those communities to commit more crime. That's enough of the data. The data is important because it shows us where we are and how far we need to go, but it's not as powerful as personal stories, which is why I started this video series. I've got another story to tell, which is what brings me to my side yard. When I was 9 or 10, we moved to a new neighborhood, and we're playing with my new neighborhood friends in one of the neighbor's side yards, much like the one that I've got here, except that his seemed longer. We're having a fun time when the neighbor's medium-sized dog comes out and starts barking. I had no significant experience with dogs before then. The vast majority of first-generation Chinese families don't have dogs or cats, probably because the parents are too frugal to own one. The dog senses that I fear it and gets aggressive. I back up towards the fence door, and the dog rushes me. I run towards the dog, because what else should I have done? Certainly not open the door behind me and leave. I end up at the other end of the side yard, with the dog trying to bite me as we briefly pass each other in the middle. We do this another couple of times, until the dog eventually knocks me down and bites me lightly on the forearm. The dog wasn't trying to kill me. He was just trying to protect its owner. After the neighbor gets the dog off of me, I run back home in tears, and I never play with that neighbor again. There's another large dog in the same neighborhood, and every time we pass by that dog owner's house, the dog runs out to the front yard fence and barks very aggressively at my brother and I. One time, my aunt came by our house, and the dog rushed the fence again. But instead of being afraid of the dog, my aunt very slowly pet that large dog, and the dog seemed to really enjoy it. I thought that was the strangest thing in the world. Maybe she had dog magic. I didn't believe that dogs could be friendly, and I was very scared of dogs for the next 8 to 10 years. Because of those experiences, if I had to choose between adopting a dog or a cat, I'm sure that I would have adopted a cat. It wasn't until I visited a college friend's house for a weekend, and they had a very large and friendly dog, that I became comfortable around dogs again. Is it fair for me to judge all dogs based on my initial experiences with dogs? Is it fair for me to judge all Black men based on my early childhood experiences? My later experiences overwhelmingly tell me no. I should judge each person individually. But what if I just kept a healthy paranoia for Black men? I suspect that if I did, I would be less likely to help or cooperate with Black people when the situation arose. For example, if a Black job candidate and a non-Black job candidate with equal credentials applied for a job, Wouldn't you expect my healthy paranoia to cause me to interview the non-black candidate at a higher rate than the black one? I'm afraid that I would, if I accepted black paranoia.